Has taken a knock, with unemployment rising by 1 percentage point in the first quarter of 2020. In the latest quarterly labour force survey, Statistics South Africa says unemployment usually increases between the first and fourth quarter of each year. Our business reporter, Wandiswa Ntengeto, has more.
The number of unemployed South Africans now stands at 7.1 million. Unemployment rose to 30.1% in the first quarter of 2020, having remained unchanged in the fourth quarter of last year at 29.1%. Statistics South Africa says black African women are the most vulnerable group in the labour market.
Let us look at the population groups. In terms of population groups, indeed, your black Africans remain much more vulnerable to labour markets, far above the national average. They are sitting at 33.8% compared to the coloureds at 24%, the Indian Asians at 13%, and the white population group at 8.1%. When we go further and look at the official unemployment rate and look at women particularly, black African women are most vulnerable to unemployment or to labour markets.
Data shows that unemployment among youths between the ages of 15 and 34 is higher than in other age groups, irrespective of their education.
We can see that our unemployment rate for those with less than matric is sitting at 38.2%. That is 35.2%, my apologies. And those with matric is about 31.4%. But the moment we go to graduates, we drop to 9.5%, as well as other tertiary sitting at 19.2%. And that tells us that when we address education, means when people have higher levels of education, they are able to secure employment.
As South Africa's labour market grapples with the spread of COVID-19, many people believe the statistics will be far worse for the second quarter of the year.
The 30.1% unemployment rate is actually quite shocking at this stage, indeed, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, a lot of people have lost jobs and are still going to lose jobs.
Against the backdrop of the release of this data, SA Express employees gathered outside the Union building in Pretoria to plead with the government not to make them mere unemployment statistics.
We knew that the president is here at the union buildings to come here and to plead with him to escalate the matter, to come here and say that, can you please say something to us? The people that have hired us cannot even come out and say anything. Via email or a phone call or a sit down, they've not said anything.
While these statistics on the country's labour market sheds light on the dire economic climate, Statistics South Africa cautions that these numbers do not include lockdown labour market activity. For Newzroom Africa on Channel 405, I am Wandiswa Ntengeto in Pretoria.
Now, many of those battling to find jobs are aged between 15 and 34. Activists have been saying that the government simply isn't doing enough to generate employment for the next generation. Crystal Duncan-Williams Project Lead at Youth Capital joins us now. Crystal, good evening and thank you so much for your time. Firstly, what are you reading into these latest numbers that Stats SA has released?
Good evening, Kathy. I think I'm reading into it with a lot of caution. We know that this is only until March of this year, so before the pandemic has really taken effect. And so we know that these numbers are only going to get worse. I know that there's the perception going around that unemployment often increases between Q4 and Q1. But if we look at Q1 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020, we've seen that amongst the youth, the rate of young people not in an education, employment or training has also increased by 1%. And this is pre-COVID, so for me this raises lots of alarm bells.
Sure. What are the solutions that need to be put on the table? What are the things that government needs to be looking at now in order to unlock opportunities for young people?
So we at Youth Capital have spent the last 2.5 years going across the country and speaking to young people, both face-to-face and via social media. And we've spoken to over 600 young people. And we think youth voices are the main missing ingredient in solving youth unemployment. Secondly, there isn't a collective and shared agenda for everybody working in the sector. So people tend to have their own goals and their own ideas, but nowhere is all of this coming together behind one common plan. And so at Youth Capital, we've come up with an action plan, a 10-point plan that we believe reflects the lived experiences of young people, as well as the data and research to support our calls. One of which is looking at existing incentives like the employment tax incentives, CETA funding, triple BE, the existing tax incentives, and saying how do we unlock these for small and medium enterprises to be able to access these funds and to create jobs for young people.
It's such an interesting point that you raise when you talk about the inclusion of youth voices in coming up with some of these solutions. Do you think that this problem could have been solved much earlier if in fact the voices of young people were given an opportunity, if they were given a significant seat at the table to be able to say how they think they would be able to create opportunities in their own lives for employment?
Absolutely, Kathy. We hear from young people over and over again. They often get spoken at and get told what to do, but nobody ever asks them what they think or how they view their lives. And they're the ones living it. Life today is very different from what life was like for many of those making those decisions in positions of power. And I do believe if young people were included in the conversation in more meaningful ways and less tokenistic ways, we might have come up with innovative solutions that actually make a difference a long time ago.
What happens now? Tomorrow is the emergency budget that is going to be announced by the finance minister. The picture is expected to be a bleak one, to say the least. What will you particularly be looking at, which will give you an indication of the extent to which government is on track in terms of resolving the youth unemployment issue?
So in the SONA and in the budget speech made in February, the president announced the launch of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, which we were very excited about. The great thing about this intervention is it builds on existing incentives and initiatives and programs and wasn't expected to need a lot of extra budget. So I'm really hoping in the budget speech tomorrow that the budget that does exist for this intervention does not get shifted elsewhere, and also that there's more accountability. So these programs have existed before, like the Public Works Program, the National Youth Service, but there's been poor accountability and reporting on their effectiveness. So I would hope that going forward, where money is tight, when we do spend money on these interventions, that they're held to account and that we can see what is working and what is not working, so we can correct course quickly. Without it costing too much tax money.
And of course, right now, you know, it's quite difficult to talk about some of the long-term reforms that you'll be looking at because, you know, we're in a state of flux. No one really knows what the next 6 months will look like, especially if we aren't able to contain the spread of COVID-19 in this country.
Absolutely, and this is why we were saying even before COVID-19, the economic outlook for South Africa is poor. We know that GDP is going down, economic growth is stagnant. So we're saying look at what exists. How do we make work in the informal sector count? How do we make work in the social economy count towards meaningful jobs for young people? At community level, in people's individual capacities, how do we help young people to bridge the gap when they leave school and the difficulties and the barriers they face in finding work when they leave places of study? So things like mentorship, helping young people increase their social capital, giving them information on how to write up a CV, how to present yourself for an interview. These are things that all South Africans can get involved in. We don't have to wait for government and big business to address some of these issues.
In the interim, however, you do still have that number where the majority of young people in this country who also make up a majority of the population are unemployed, and that in itself is a big problem for the day-to-day experiences of many of these individuals.
Absolutely. We know that when young people step out of a place of study, they face many barriers. The cost of job seeking, there are various research papers that put it anywhere between 300 and 700 Rand a month that young people spend just on looking for work. And as you say, these are young people who live in households that don't have, many of them live in households without an employed adult. So where does this money come from for job seeking? Young people don't have adults in their life that they can turn to for advice on how to find employment opportunities. And so at Youth Capital, we're saying, if you are an adult and you are employed, if you connect with one young person, this could make a huge difference. While we wait for big government policy shifts or implementation plans to be improved upon, like the things I've already mentioned, there are things at a more community level that can be done.
All right, Crystal Duncan-Williams of Project Lead at Youth Capital. Thanks for your time on News at Prime tonight.